Hello and welcome back to Ride Rescue. On this episode, I'll take you through the body mods that I decided to do on the front end of the car. In my last video, we talked about the tail end. Now we'll get into the front end and the doors. There were a lot of things about the car when I would take the car to car shows that just irritated me. There was fits and finishes that Buick could have done a better job with when they were designing the car. But there's a lot of commonalities between the A-body size cars, the Chevelles, the GTOs, the Olds Cutlass, where those design cues kind of transferred from car to car. And in particular on the Buick was this area of the windshield. The body lines and the contours, it had this beautiful sweeping line that came down off of the windshield on the A-pillar. That, in my opinion, in the 64 and the A-bodies, this is probably the most attractive body line, but it was destroyed by the square edge of the fender. Now, the Chevelles and the GTOs, that worked together. It fit in the style of the body, but the Buick, it just didn't work. The gaps were large, the squaring off of the panel and the door fitment and the fender and the line that went up over the cowl to the windshield wipers, all those lines just fought what the shape and the styling of the body line should have been. So I did some drastic changes in that area in the A-pillar. I also wanted to change the shape of the fender of the inner fender well. When you open up the hood, the inner fender well panel above the fender well itself, from the top of the fender to the fender well, that area had holes in it that just didn't look like they belonged there. It had a big lump in it with a bolt welded to it that didn't belong there. It must have had something to do with the manufacturing and how all the pieces were put on, because I believe they assembled a full front clip and then they just kind of dropped it on during the assembly line and put on the hood and adjusted all those parts. So there was probably some meaning behind that, but it was ugly. The fender, the inner fender, came down and out against the top of the fender well, and the bolts came up through below the fender well, up into the fender, and the back sides of those bolts were exposed up through, and they were ugly. So it was another thing that just irritated me. If that top fender would have just been bent inwards, and the bolts came up from the back side, you wouldn't see them. It would be a nice clean line. So that's what I ended up doing. Plus, the fender wells, now that I've got this on air ride suspension, when this car is all the way down on the ground, those fender wells set right on the tire. It's just barely touching, but it's just enough that I don't want any rub at all. And then the shape of the fender well to the outer side of the fender, the tires, because these tires are so wide and flat, that would rub on the inside of the fender well pretty good. So I wanted to square off that fender well instead of having a sloping, rounded area. So I pie cut a bunch of slots in that inside of that fender, reshaped it, and then welded back in some more pie shapes to really crisp up that outer side. Couldn't see any of that from the engine compartment, so I didn't have to worry about really cleaning all that up. Plus, you wouldn't be able to see it from up underneath either. But I did grind it all smooth from the inside, so you couldn't tell. But inside of the fender well itself, that wasn't really all that clean, but it didn't need to be. As the fender came all the way down to the nose by the headlight, there was a seam there too. And that seam, spot welded together, it didn't have a seam sealer on it. It would get moisture in there and it would get a little rusty look that would come down onto the finish. It just was not a very nice looking finish there either. So I welded that seam in. There was one across the hood that had that same type of a seam that would get rusty moisture coming out of it. So I cleaned up that seam and welded over that full seam too, and then filled it so that that was all smooth. And I just think that's the way it should have been done from the factory. While I was changing that inner fender area and the fender well, I raised it up just slightly. So that panel between the top of the fender and the fender well, I shortened it up about 1/2 inch. So I trimmed it off, and then I welded that panel back in. I just reversed it. I took one side to the other side so that that flange went underneath the fender instead of sticking out on top of the fender well lips. And raised that up and put a weld across it, and I was able to clean that bottom edge up too. And then all the holes and the lumps and the protrusions and the bolts that weren't necessary, I removed all of that and welded over all the holes and smoothed that whole panel. So from the hinges all the way to the headlight, it was just a smooth transition with a little bit of a lip that kept that factory look on the seam, and then the rubber stoppers and guides was on top of that lip. So it still had that factory look, but it was just all cleaned up. So when it comes to the area at the A-pillar where the A-pillar trim on the windshield comes down and meets the fender, and all that ties into the door, that swooping line coming off of the A-pillar and windshield into the fender, just kind of a waterfall effect down across from the window and down across from the fender. So I was thinking, there's no reason why I can't just trim that ugly area off of the front door and then weld it into the fender and mold all that together so it does have that nice waterfall sloping look. Once I cut the door off, then I got excited. It's like, I can really see a nice look. That A-pillar is just a cap. It has screws that go underneath at the vent window, and it has some screws that go along the inside of the windshield where the trim covers it up. That just snaps on. So where it tied into the fender just butted up against it. When you took the fender off, it just had a couple screws that held that A-pillar down, and then the fender would go up against it. All I had to do was take that fender and the A-pillar and run a bead of weld across that and welded it all together. And then I ground off the overlapping metal on the backside and reinforced it with some plates. And then the piece of metal that I cut off of the door, I then welded to the fender and that upper A-pillar piece that snaps on, and reinforced all that together and made it look like it was all one piece. And the first time I took the car to a car show, guys thought I was nuts. They said, I can't believe you would have the guts to weld a fender to the car. It wasn't. That was the thing that was so beautiful about it, is all that piece, once the screws were out of the back side of that A-pillar, the whole thing just snapped off with the fender. I could snap it into place, do all the body and filler work and paint, and that's the way the car should have looked coming from the factory. And it was something that if that fender was damaged, it could be done again. It was fairly easy to recontour, to weld it all together, and still be able to snap it on and off. Once that door to fender to A-pillar area was all finished, it just had a real elegant, smooth look the way it should have been. Down the midway of this car, basically, I've heard it called the belt line of the car, there was a big wide panel molding. On a restored car, it looks really good, but on what I'm planning on doing with this car, I want to go with a real dark color. And a dark color, those panels have to be perfectly flat, or it'll show all the flaws. And I wanted to go back with some trim down the road, but I want to go with just a narrow, thin piece of trim. I don't want the big wide trim. But in the meantime, I was just planning on enjoying the car, just all big, long, flat panels. And then maybe down the road, just keep adding and changing and making subtle little differences. On the front end of the car, the bumper, similar to the back, it was sticking out from the car. So, of course, if somebody bumps into it, it doesn't just jam it into the fender. Had a little bit of an area for it to move. It also was lower. There was some real beautiful body contours and lines that matched up from the fender to the front bumper. I could see would be a really nice finish if I could just get those to tuck really tight. I saw it done actually by Chip Foose on an overhauling show where they had done that with the 65 Buick. The 65 Buick bumper just does not fit the contour of the fender, and it didn't look very good. It didn't really work out. But this car, the shape of the bumper and the shape of the fender, by cutting the front of the fender off, taking that bumper and pushing it all the way back so that it was smooth with the front lip of the fender, I could then puzzle piece all that area back in against that bumper and make that bumper just tight against the fender. Once I started doing that, I realized there's some vibration in the chassis and the body. The way the front clip is mounted on with rubber bushings is probably going to chip the paint off. So I went a little bit further than I probably should have, but I'm glad I did. I welded a plate on the back side of the bumper, and I drilled holes in that plate, tapped it, and ran bolts right in from the fender, and literally bolted the fender and the bumper together. I put a lot of miles on it after I got it painted. Kind of jump into the future. It worked out great. I never chipped the paint. It was a wow factor. Taking it to car shows, people always flip. Sadly, I didn't get all the images of that area. There was so much involved and all the piecing it all together. There was a lot of little wedge cuts, little flat pieces, a lot of contours and shaping to get all of that to fit together. Not only did I bring the bumper back, but I wanted to raise the bumper. The grille and the headlights in the 64 Skylarks sit low, and then the bumper sits below that. And the headlight brackets that go around the headlight, the way it screws on next to the grille, there's 2 screws above and 2 screws below, and that whole thing can slide out, and it's got a big wide flange on it. I wanted to raise the grille and headlights into that area, and I wanted to go tight up against the hood because you could get, you could literally get your whole hands across the top of that grille in between the hood and the grille. So I wanted to tighten that up as much as I could. So the headlight bezels, that big flange where the 2 screws were on top and bottom, I shaved that off as much as I could so that it would still be attractive and yet still hold the screws in the middle of it, so that when you did get down, it would look like it came from the factory that way. And the same thing from the bumper. The bumper I wouldn't be able to put up and overlap that bottom bracket for 2 reasons. One, the look of it is going to be off-center. Plus, you need to be able to take that off if you need to change a headlight. If the headlight got broken or if the headlight quit working, I need to have access to those 4 screws so that I could take that headlight bezel off and do any work with the headlights. And in addition to making the changes on the positioning of the grille and the bumper, the base of the core support where it's set on the frame was right behind the bumper brackets that came up and held that bumper. So when I moved the bumper all the way back, that core support had to move back a little bit too. So I had to make some modifications where the core support, the top of the core support mounted to the corners of the fenders, and move those back a little bit too. And by doing that, I was actually able to move the grille up and move it back a little bit more and set that grille back in with just a subtle look that really changed the overall look of the nose of the car. Where the grille used to set out a little bit, by setting it back, it kind of tucked it underneath the hood, and that gap between the hood and the top of the grille wasn't as noticeable. And then I was able to kind of tie it into the bumper too, where I moved it back just off of the bumper. Originally from the factory, the grille kind of set over a lip on the bumper. I was able to set it back just past that lip and kind of line it up, and it tied all that into a new look, but it looked like that's the way it was supposed to be. Where I had tied the bumper and the fender all together, originally the bumper was flared out a little bit. It kind of stuck out. I bent those inwards so that it was smooth with the sides of the fender, and then I pulled the nose out, similar to what I did in the back, right at the license plate, so that it had a little more of a bend in the nose that pulled those corners in even more. So it just really finished off the nose of the car. When I shaved all the trim off the car, I decided I wasn't going to put any of the emblems back on. I wanted people to walk up to the car and think, what is it? What kind of car is it? Most people, when they'd walk up to the car, they'd think it was a Chevelle. Typically the comments were a 67 Chevelle. And I had a friend that I would park next to a lot that has a 67 Chevelle convertible. So it was great to have the two cars side by side, because people's first thought was Chevelle, and then they'd see the Chevelle and go, no, wait, what is it? The only emblems that I was planning on putting back on the car that would tell the story of what the car was: the steering wheel had a Buick emblem in the middle of the horn button. The glove box has a Skylark emblem. And then in addition to that, on the outside of the car, the only thing that I wanted to show would be the little bird. So on the side of the front fender, just before the door and the fender well, I dimpled in the metal right there, just the thickness of that small bird emblem. I wrapped that small bird with masking tape, and then I mounted it to that dimpled area on the fender, and then I filled over it with body filler. And then while the body filler was still soft, I just went around the edge of it with a toothpick and opened up the edges of that bird so that when the filler dried, I could knock the bird back out of that mounting hole from the back side of the fender. And then I just gently sand around that edge and open it up just enough so that by the time I primed it and painted it, the bird would be able to fit back in there. So it just set right back in to the painted finish and had a really neat finished high-end professional look. At this point in the past videos, I've gone over all of the costs involved in each video and each step of the way. Since I'm getting now into doing a lot of body work, a lot of filler, a lot of sanding, a lot of priming, doing some paint in some areas like the door jambs underneath the trunk, what I'll do is I'll just tally all that up. All the costs of filler, paint, primer, everything that goes into all the labor. Once I have the car completely finished and ready for paint, then I'll go back over all the costs. So stay tuned for future videos of the Buick build. I really appreciate you tuning in. Please give me a like, hit the subscribe button. Any support is really appreciated. TTFN, ta-ta for now.